People talk about the decline in Japanese innovative capacity. And, you know, there's a big difference between technological or scientific power and commercial genius. And what happens is computers and digital technology and software can do tremendous things, but companies have to know how to take advantage of it. You can do things if you simply use computers to cut costs of things you're already doing. You're not going to grow productivity very much.
こんにちは皆さん。ビジネス Success Japan のポッドキャストへようこそ。Hello everyone and welcome to the Business Success Japan podcast. This is your host, Lydia Buchelman. This podcast is for those who want to develop or strengthen the communication skills, cultural savvy, insights into current trends and conditions, and mindsets that are essential in a Japanese business environment. The helpful practical suggestions and engaging insights offered here provide listeners with the in-depth cultural context needed to achieve their own version of success while collaborating with Japanese counterparts. Today, I'm excited to share a follow-up conversation that I was able to have with Richard Katz. Richard is a special correspondent for weekly Toyo Keizai and the publisher of Japan Economy Watch on Substack at richardkatz.substack.com. In today's episode, we dig into his latest book entitled The Contest for Japan's Economic Future, Entrepreneurs vs. Corporate Giants. It centers on the growing opportunity to revive Japan's economy through entrepreneurship. It's already available in English and will be out in Japanese in 2025. His two previous books were Japan, The System That Soured, and Japanese Phoenix, both of which are also available in Japanese. His essays and op-eds have been published in Foreign Affairs, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Financial Times, and The International Economy. He's testified several times to congressional committees. He also taught about Japan's economy as an adjunct lecturer at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and New York University. He received his master's in economics from New York University in 1996. But be sure to keep listening to hear more about his background and work in Japan. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast today. It's been a while since we last spoke, though we did get to connect briefly at an event at Temple University, it was great to finally meet you. And I'm just really excited to get to catch up a little bit on your work and more specifically on the book that you've more recently published.
Okay, good. I'm glad to be here.
So, yeah, just to get started, would you mind briefly introducing yourself to my audience?
Sure. So my name is Richard Katz, and I am a special correspondent for Toyo Keizai, which is one of the three big general business weeklies. I have my own blog on Substack called Japan Economy Watch. I had published a newsletter in the old days when print media was the thing for about a couple decades called the Oriental Economist Report. My new book, The Contest for Japan's Economic Future, is the third I've written on Japan. The first one was 26 years ago, called The System That Soured. And so that's what I do. And right now I got the book out. It was a labor of love, but it was really hard work. And it's out now in English from Oxford and will be out hopefully later in the year by Hayakawa Publishing in Japanese. And it's also being published in Chinese.
That's great to hear. It's a book that I was lucky enough to pick up pretty much right away when it came out, but I tried to recommend it to pretty much anybody with an interest in Japan, but I thought it was a shame I couldn't recommend it to my Japanese friends or Japanese teachers. So I'm glad to hear that there's a Japanese version coming out soon.
Yes, me too.
So how did you end up getting involved with Japan in the first place?
Yeah, well, it was an accident, like a lot of things in life. So I was at Columbia University during the Vietnam War and part of the anti-war movement, and I read a lot. I never really had an academic course in Vietnamese history, and that was the days before people had adjuncts as professors. And so Columbia had nobody on its faculty who knew anything about Vietnam after all those years. So there was no course to take on Vietnam, but there was a semester, a two-part semester. One was a seminar. One was on China and one was on Japan. And the only thing I knew about Japan was when my parents bought me a toy, and this will tell people how old I am. When my parents had bought me a toy and it broke 3 days later, I knew it was made in Japan. So that's what I knew about Japan. And then when I took this course, I found it the most fascinating country. Its history is so dramatic. It's up, it's down, it's up again, it's down again, it's up again. It was also one of the only two countries that had escaped European colonialism during the 19th century and early 20th century. And that made that an interesting point during the Vietnam War. And as well, it had really done a very rapid march from feudalism to become an industrial power. Beat Russia in a war, beat China in a war, then beat Russia in a matter of a few decades. And so its ability to upgrade itself through industrial policy was also fascinating to me as a major in history and economics. So that's how I became interested. It was just, you know, fell into it.
Great. And how did you end up aligning yourself with focusing on the Japanese economy specifically?
Well, I was very much interested in economics. That was my focus because I really thought economics is so important to people's lives, but it's also so important to political power and who's got power within a society as well as between society. And there was also the US Japan trade frictions were taking off. So I got interested and I started doing freelance journalism, writing for Japanese publications about US Japan relations. And then that grew more and more. And finally, Diamond Weekly. I wasn't making a lot of money, so I went back to graduate school to get my master's degree in economics. And Diamond Weekly, meanwhile, Shukan Daimondo, hired me as a full time, not as a regular employee, as a contract worker, but with a full time salary. So that was great. And then I got laid off during the bust in the 90s, but luckily I got picked up by Toyo Keizai, my newsletter. So that's and then my I did my master's thesis. I didn't do it at the time because I didn't need it. I had a job and I had the coursework I wanted. But I went back to do my master's thesis, figuring I'd get some boring bank job or something. And I wrote it about um, the business model that I had learned that Japan had used so successfully to really have extraordinary growth in the high growth days, the economic miracle days. Was terrific, but all models become obsolete at some point, which is one of the reasons why we have lots of new companies doing new technologies because it's harder for older companies to change their model. It's also hard for countries, especially countries with one party democracy. Having exchanges of parties helps countries change course. And so the question was whether Japan was just having a rough patch in the 1990s that would get back into the shape as a lot of people thought, or this was a permanent downshift because of structural defects, mainly because they were continuing to practice the policies that had worked so well in the past and they refused to change as things changed. And so my first book actually came out of that thesis. In the middle of writing it, I realized, oh, this is a book. Maybe I can get a publisher to agree. And so that's sort of put me on the map. That was called Japan, the System That Soured, The Rise and Fall of the Japanese Economic Miracle. It came out in the summer of 98, which is when the banking crisis in Asia and the overall Asian financial crisis really, really was, at its worst. And so the timing made it quite interesting to people. So that's it.
Right. And so your more recent book is a lot more focused on, of course, looking at those structural issues that are holding the Japanese economy back in so many ways. But it's also done a big shift in focus towards the importance of entrepreneurship and the startups that have been growing recently in Japan. So, why do you think it's so important for the government and the economy to focus much more on startups and entrepreneurs more specifically rather than giants that made those giant conglomerates that made the Japan model so worldwide famous in the first place?
Sure. Yeah, it's not only about the things holding Japan back. This is, which is the first book about that. This is really about how it can get out of the soup. And and the good news is that in working on it, I saw so many positive trends that are underneath the surface that people don't see. If you look at big business, you look at politics, things seem very static and a bit gridlocked. But if you look under the surface at generational change, technological change, you see a lot of things which are very positive trends. So we'll get back to that. So that's the point. I learned a lot doing it. The reason I focus on entrepreneurship is that in all countries, rich countries, let's take, the more competition you have among companies, that creates the need for efficiency. You become more innovative and more efficient, or you die. But entrepreneurship, new companies are particularly important because they're the carrier of new ideas. The companies in, say, in the United States that were on top of electronics in the days of radio, they no longer exist. It was a whole different set of companies that were in the TV era. And the ones in the TV era didn't go into PCs. Those were all new companies. So you call it electronics, but they're very different industries, very different companies. But the same thing is even true within a field like, say, the companies that were on top in airplanes were not on top of jet engines. In cars, when the oil crisis hit in the 70s, the way the Japanese come in, and maybe today, the way the Chinese are coming in electrical vehicles. So Japan has the least countries that have entrepreneurship are able to shift, have fresh ideas, able to not be tied to past practices, really have a big boost of productivity, and countries that have a lot of entrepreneurship grow faster. So it doesn't mean you don't need the big firms, but you need a proper balance between the amount of entrepreneurship and the amount of big firms. And Japan is really skewed only to the big firms, and the big firms themselves perform better when they're faced with challengers. The reason the legacy firms are moving to electric vehicles is because Tesla put them to the challenge. And so Japan really needs that, but Japan unfortunately has the least amount of entrepreneurship among all the rich countries in the OECD. And the question is, what are the reasons for that? But more importantly, are there indigenous trends in Japan that would allow Japan to have more entrepreneurship? It was entrepreneurship that drove the high growth era. The companies that are the giants now, a lot of them were small and medium enterprises back in the 40s and 50s. They grew to become giants. Japan was safe for entrepreneurship then, and that's what drove the miracle to a very great extent. Not entirely, wasn't the only factor, but it was a very big deal. Japan needs to resurrect that. And the question to me was, are there indigenous trends moving in that direction? Yes, there are. However, in order to reach critical mass, they really need to be supported by government policy, and that they're not getting yet. The government is still focused on shoring up the incumbents, whether they be the big giants or they be zombie mom and pop shops and SMEs.
hmm Would you mind explaining a little bit more about these zombie companies? I feel like it's a term that gets batted around a lot, but we don't really define it.
Sure. It's The Walking Dead. These are companies whose productivity is very poor. In often cases, it's disguised unemployment, disguised welfare for people who, under the lifetime employment system, have retired from their first job. They set up a mom and pop shop. About 6% of Japan's GDP, a huge amount, is devoted to public loans or public guarantees, credit guarantees to these companies, the most in the OECD. Basically, in case they can't pay the debts, they pay if the government steps in. So they're shored up because Japan does not have the kind of social safety net, the overt social safety net, which will allow people to transition from one job to another and take care of them in between to help them transition. And so your current job at your current company is your safety net. And therefore, Japan keeps alive these companies, which, they often are losing money, but they keep getting bank loans because of the political pressure to keep them around. They get these public government loans. And if the interest rate is 0.25% a year, which is now about 15% of all bank loans charged, that little, 0.25% per year. Anybody can look like they're paying the debts at that level, but in fact, you're not really. You're paying a couple $1,000s a year. And so, if and when interest rates rise to a substantial degree, a lot of these companies will really be in serious trouble. And we will again see the kind of crisis we saw in the 1990s and the first half of the 2000s when lots and lots of companies could not pay their debts. And so these are companies that they have no reason to exist except a disguised form of welfare and old age support for people who were in their post-retirement job. And they
Mm-hmm.
also, because Japan has cut pension funds and healthcare per senior by 20% since the 1990s. So this is a disguised form of doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But they are a big voting base. And so, the Liberal Democratic Party tries to do this stuff, even though it hurts the economy. And so they give with one hand this credit and these loans to keep them alive. But on the other hand, they cut the pension funds to the people who own these firms. So one hand giveth, one hand taketh away. Are people really better off? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm. I think that people would be surprised to hear that the social safety net in Japan is comparatively weak. And would you mind telling us a little bit more about why that is?
Sure. When in the high growth era, it was a miracle in so many ways. But one of the things is that a rising tide did indeed lift all boats, so that you had full employment. People came off the farm, and because there were plenty of jobs for them to go to, people who there was a lot of shift in sectors. So textiles became a smaller part of the economy, and steel and cars became a larger part. People did shift from job to job, even with the lifetime employment system. So if a company downsized, you could get another job very, very easily. There was equality of income, like the Scandinavians had, the Japanese had in the private market, so that the fruits of growth were really spread very, very evenly among the population. And so you really did not need a big, heavy government funded social safety net because the private market was really doing that work. But when the oil crises hit and growth slowed down, and in all countries, you don't grow 10% forever. That's something that newly industrializing countries do. And then once you become more mature, you do slow down. China's going through that now. And so as that happens, then you had companies they try to shore up companies that they should have let go. As some industries, they're no longer competitive. And they try to shore them up, like textiles for a long time, coal mining for a long, all sorts of things. And so they then use, instead of using industrial policy to promote the industries of the future, they were using the same industrial policy tools to protect the industries of the past. And people were sort of on the outs having unemployment. People, uh, their real wages were suffering, and people would be in transition from job to job. The unemployment insurance scheme was very, very thin. Even though on paper it looks like it's really giving you a lot of percentage of your lost income, actually, people get only about 15 to 20% of the income they lose by being unemployed. So it's not as good as it looks like on paper. And the government, in order to deal with budget deficits, we can't afford to have a big social safety net. And so they never transitioned. When the private market by itself was unable to supply all of these benefits, the government did not transition to the overt social safety net, but it began to subsidize the companies where people worked to make sure those companies didn't fail and therefore the people lose their jobs. But the but that process won them votes and won social stability, but it kept dragging down growth, got lower and lower and lower. And then they really could not afford to do a lot of the things they should have done because the tax revenue was going down. But the tax revenue was going down because of the low growth. And so they really got themselves into a trap, into a vicious cycle. And now you'll have today, when a lot of things that Japan should do, the Ministry of Finance will say, we can't afford to do it. And I say, you can't afford not to do it because if you don't, you won't get a boost to GDP growth, therefore you won't get the tax revenue. And yet they've cut corporate taxes while they're raising taxes on people. They've cut corporate taxes from 50% highest rate for the biggest companies to about 30%. And the company said, if you cut our taxes, we're going to invest a lot more. But they didn't. And so the companies are just hoarding cash, hoarding cash. They don't plow back into the economy. They don't plow it back in investment. They don't plow it back in wages. And so you have this chronic budget deficit. It's really a mess.
Hmm. And so, given that propping up these companies wasn't, I assume it wasn't any cheaper than just actually supporting a proper social safety net. Why why did
But it's
they just take that route? Yeah.
disguised. And the other reason is that Japanese banker explained this to me, that society's losers don't want to feel like losers. It's just like, farmers get tariff protection. All over the world, they get huge tariff protection, but they feel they're in the free market. They feel like, well, no, we're being protected in our market, in our job. In fact, it's government subsidies that are keeping them around. I remember this very famous sign, tax protesters in the US, keep your government hands off my Social Security. Well, what do you think Social Security is? It's a government program. And so by doing it this way, you don't look like you're on the public dole. So people don't feel like losers. They feel better about themselves. And other countries, people in Scandinavia, for example, have found much better ways to do this, where you combine the efficiency of the market and transitioning people to a social safety net, which is universal, and it works and people accept it because they all pay taxes. They all get aid education, healthcare, and all sorts of other things. And I think that's actually much more in keeping with the Japanese communitarian culture than is the Anglo-Saxon system, which I think is this rugged individualism pretending, which is much less in common, I think, with Japanese culture. But yeah, it would
Yeah.
have been to do it the right way.
Yeah, when people discuss Japanese business culture, those are the first things that they point to. They point to the lifetime employment system, risk aversion, people just wanting to stay in the same place, doing the same job for their entire careers. But you mentioned that those ideas are somewhat of a myth. You mentioned that there are other approaches that are more in keeping with Japanese culture. So, would you mind breaking down a couple of more of those cultural artifacts for us that may
Sure.
not be what they seem?
The lifetime employment system was something like lots of other things. Everything that works, that has a value, a benefit, also has a cost. It's one of the first things you learn in economics. The question is whether the benefits are bigger than the costs. And when you are having population growth and high economic growth, the lifetime employment system had a lot of benefits to it, because people who are not afraid of losing their job will want the company to improve its technology because it'll make more profits and they'll pay you higher wages. And companies want to train people because they're not afraid they're going to go someplace else. But when you have a declining population, an aging population, companies downsizing, it really prevents the shift in labor from declining firms and declining industries to growing ones. It prevents entrepreneurs from having ability to recruit staff. Again, that's changing now. That's one of the positive changes. But also, people are bored as hell. One of these, a manager of a Japanese private equity firm, said to me, my grandfather's day, a secure job when he walked to school without shoes as a kid after the war. So a secure job in a big company, that was nirvana. He said, my father was bored as hell at his lifetime employment, but he had no alternative because it provided security, but he hated his job because now in my generation, we think we least the best and the brightest, say the top 15, 20%. They see their value. They think they have opportunities. They're willing to do things and switch jobs. This idea about risk aversion being a Japanese cultural trait, it is absolutely not. If that were true, you would not have companies like Sharp betting the farm that they could develop a new products, which if they fail would have gone bankrupt, but they created the microwave oven and the digital watch with Casio and the handheld calculator and all sorts of products. Tremendous. They developed a chip, which later on is the backbone of the Toshiba laptop, which was invented in Japan, the whole notion of a laptop. These were very risk-taking companies, but what happened was they developed a promotion system in the 1970s where, and I've never been able to find an answer about why it was done,
Hmm.
but where you sort of got, it was asymmetric in the sense that on your job, when they would measure your job effectiveness, if you made mistakes, that hurt you. But if you did something really good, you didn't get any extra points for that. You were just doing your job. So basically, you are training people not to take a chance. You're training people to play it safe, to avoid mistakes. Whereas if you penalize people for mistakes, which even there, is that what you really should do? Or maybe you should figure out why that was a mistake. Was it just dumb? Or was it a calculated judgment call which happened not to work out? And what can we learn from it? But if you had a balance between when you promote people, take into account the stuff they do that's beyond the normal, as well as the problems, then you wouldn't be training people. So a lot of what we call risk aversion was people trained in a system. If you left your job to work for a new company, you could never get a job that good again, ever. And these days, it's even worse. You become a low paid, non regular worker. Whereas, I had a cousin who worked for Hewlett Packard. And during the dot com boom, his boss developed a server which could deliver twice the capacity, but no more heat. Heat is the big Satan in servers. So he wanted to leave Hewlett Packard, his boss, and form a new company. And Hewlett Packard said, fine, you're going to do it. Everybody at Hewlett Packard does this. We're going to buy 15% of your company. And if you succeed, we're all going to get rich. And if you fail, you come back to us. So, wow. So if it works, they're the internet millionaire. And if it doesn't work, they get their job back. Does that mean that they were more risk seeking? No, it means there was less risk. And in Japan, when you create a system in which the rewards for success are basically pretty mediocre and the penalties for failure are really awful. I mean, you lose your house, your insurance, your everything if you go bankrupt, a personal bankruptcy. If you're a company and you take out a loan, a business loan, you have to sign a personal guarantee. If the business fails, again, you lose your house, your savings, your firstborn child. I mean, so it's not that Japanese are culturally more risk averse, except insofar as they've been trained in a job situation to act that way. It's that the risk reward ratio is really, really bad. That's what is adverse. And so you put Japanese in a different situation, they're going to act differently. It's the situations that's the problem, not the Japanese brain.
Yeah, it's so interesting how people point at the results and see them as the cause when a lot of times it's the other way around. And the birth rate is another example of that, where people are like, oh, Japanese people don't want to have babies. But in reality, a lot of it goes back to what you were saying about the issues around having so many non regular workers and people not being able to go back to regular full time job once they've lost those positions. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about how have things gotten so bad for people ending up in these non-regular roles? Why is this such a widespread phenomenon at this point?
Well, let me first talk about the consequence you just mentioned. So, a 35-year-old male who's got a non regular job, he's only got a 25% chance of getting married. Only 25% of them get married. A 35-year-old with a regular job, 75% of them get married. Now, if you ask women what they want, they would love to have two kids. That's what they want. But they don't feel that they can afford to do so. Japan spends the least on public education, the least amount of government money to pay for. I'm talking about K through 12, not even college yet, right? And people are spending thousands of dollars a year for fees, uniforms, this, that, the other thing, cram schools. And so it becomes very expensive to raise a kid, especially when your real wages are falling. There's also, there's all kinds of other social issues involved as far that affect the demography. But it's a problem not only in Japan; it's a problem elsewhere. But as Tolstoy said, all unhappy economies are unhappy in their own way. Now, why did it become so widespread? Well, the law didn't say it. Court interpretations of the law said when a company is in trouble, you can't do mass layoffs until it either gets back into shape, like in a recession, or it's just, buggy whips are no longer selling as much, so you're going to downsize. Textiles are no longer being produced in Japan, so you're going to downsize, right? So, and then you should be able to transition to a new job. Well, you can't lay people off until you're at death's door. So if you could say off 20% of your labor force, you might be able to recover and downsize. But you can't do it till you need to now lay off 80% of your labor force. So that's kind of crazy. So what the companies said was, we need flexibility. We need to be able to hire and fire people. And so what they did is they said that the non-regular work was made legal in more and more industries. Initially, it was like women who left the job market to have kids would come back to it, or older people, they would work seasonally or whatever. So then it became something became a regular thing. This began in the 90s and more with each passing decade. And they said, we're going to use this to have flexibility. But what they really did was they used it to cut wages as well. What they did is they'd say to, like, you know, half of their workers being full-time regular workers who could never be laid off and that they trained and had the skills. And the others were people that when times were bad, they could lay them off. They weren't protected, even though the Japanese law says equal pay for equal work. That law is not enforced. There's no agency. The Ministry of Labor does not enforce that law. It's not mandated to. And that's something the prime minister could do with the stroke of a pen, have them do that. So they don't do that. And as a result, this became a way for companies to cut wages because these workers were not protected. And so companies wanted to hire more. And you could have, I mean, I've been to plants, semiconductor factories, two people working side by side, regular and non-regular. The regular is wearing one uniform, the non-regular another uniform. So you really know who's who, right? So there's a status thing there as well, and a bit of a shame attached. And they're doing the same work, but they don't get this. Law says same pay, they don't get the same pay. And the companies say, well, because he doesn't have to come in on a Saturday if he doesn't want to. And the courts always rule in favor of the employers. So this became a very widespread issue of wage cutting. But the problem is, if everybody's wages are being cut, and real wages for the typical worker in Japan are no higher than they were 30 years ago. If that's the case, or 20 years ago, who's going to buy the products that the companies are producing? It has to be the government. And that's why the government keeps running this budget deficit, because they have to become the buyer of last resort because the workers can't afford to buy what they make. So that's how that became very, very widespread. Plus, they don't train those non-regular workers either. So machines break down a lot more and productivity stalls, which hurts growth.
And that's so interesting because you hear a lot about that in terms of gender inequality in Japan too, where there are laws on the books to deal with these issues, but they're so hard to enforce. It's almost impossible for people to bring things to trial. And even if they do, the results aren't necessarily going to be in their favor. And I know it's not necessarily in your specialization, but would you mind telling us a little bit more about why that is? Why is it so hard for people to actually enforce these laws for equal pay and
Because they
equal
choose
work?
not to. Because they're on the, because the campaign contributions from big business, because they think big business is what brought around prosperity. And they think they can do it again, maybe a little more corporate governance, maybe fooling around. We're going to give them support, let them merge and become even more oligopolistic and charge high prices. We'll give them tax cuts so they're going to invest more, even though they don't. And so, and plus, there's just simple outright prejudice against women. I mean, it's people say things which, in other societies, people haven't said in 40 years about, jobs that are more suitable for women's personality. Or women don't get promotion. It's also the law women should be promoted equally. They don't get promoted. Now, one of the things you see in entrepreneurial companies is you walk in, and as opposed to the tedium you see at some of the larger companies among managers, they just bored out of their gourd. You go into one of these newer firms, and there's a buzz, and there's an excitement, and people there are ambitious, they're self-confident, they have drive, they have energy, and there's tons of women there, and they are not serving tea. They are managers. And I spoke to one company named Oschool, which had 4 people in 1993. Now it's got several thousands. And I spoke to some women there who left bigger companies. One came from Itochu, and one came from one of the convenience chains. She didn't want to say which one. And they realized soon they were never going to be really promoted until maybe they were like 50 years old. And the companies didn't care what younger people thought. And they want to help build something from the ground up. So they switched to this company and they help build it. And they're really very senior managers now. And then they asked me, Why are you asking that? And all these years we've been doing interviews, nobody has ever asked us that, which I found so weird. I mean, if you want to understand, first of all, that company, and if you want to understand what's going on in Japan, why would you not ask these women about why they switched and what rewards it brought them and what was the difference? I mean, that's how you learn. It's surprising to me that no one had asked them before. But to them, it was like, why are you asking us? That's not the question people usually say. And so, one of the things, what's horrible for women in general has been terrific for the startups because one of their biggest problems was because of the lifetime employment, not being able to recruit veterans with technical skills, managerial skills, and now they can because people in their 20s, their 30s, even their 40s and 50s will want to go to these startups to get a more exciting job, a more fulfilling job. People are now much more focused on personal fulfillment. And so that's a very good thing. And it's something that's really, it's one of those positive trends that gives me hope for more entrepreneurship. Now, this is not everybody. A lot of younger people are even more cautious, even more conservative, because they're not the best and the brightest, and they're worried about if they really want to get that secure job. But the people who really have the talent, they know their value. And especially with the labor shortage, it's a very different balance of power on that. That along with technology are some of the things that are really making these underground, hard to see unless you look for them, changes that give me hope about a rebirth of entrepreneurship.
Hmm. Yeah, I was so encouraged to read and to hear the talk that I got to attend about all of the positive effects that entrepreneurship and startups have had for these underutilized, vastly underutilized women in the Japanese workforce. You mentioned being able to actually do engaging work, but are there any other ways in which startups and entrepreneurship are an especially good fit for these Japanese female workers?
I don't know that they're more of a good fit for women than they are for men. I mean, I think they're a good fit for anybody who sort of wants to create something, who wants to build something and have the opportunity to really use their brains. I mean, I had a professor friend who at Waseda who his brother worked for Sharp, which when he began was a great company and get into the doldrums. And he, at that point, became very, very cautious. He became really, really bored because he wasn't being challenged. He was just trying to avoid mistakes. And then Foxconn took it over because it was going into bankruptcy. And Foxconn said, yeah, take a chance, have a challenge, come up with an idea, pass your idea around. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, we'll figure out why and we'll learn from it. But don't be, and so now he feels like his job is challenging, it's exciting. And so the old elan came back. And this happens in so many big companies. After seeing all these entrepreneurial companies, I went to one of the giant electronics companies and met with the guys about 55. And oh my, you just felt the tedium and the boredom and the oxygen was just out of the air. So I don't think it provides a particular advantage for women because of their discrimination at bigger companies. But as far as the actual, what it does for a person and have an exciting career and fulfillment, I don't think it's any different for men or for women.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. It's not that it's better for women, it's just that they have such few opportunities, the more traditional route, that it's pretty much the only option they have.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
So, just pivoting the conversation a little bit, something else interesting I remember hearing from you was that Japanese firms rank 64th out of 64 in what's referred to as digital agility compared to other countries. Well, what does that mean and what can be done about that?
People talk about the decline in Japanese innovative capacity. And, you know, there's a big difference between technological or scientific power and commercial genius. And what happens is computers and digital technology and software can do tremendous things, but companies have to know how to take advantage of it. You can do things if you simply use computers to cut costs of things you're already doing. you're not going to grow productivity very much. But if you can use it to do things you could never do before, to invent new products and new re-engineer the company. One of the examples I like is using what's called big data. You can tell when a truck is going to break down because certain things happen in terms of temperature or heat and whatever. And UPS used it, the United Parcel Delivery. So when you can tell something's going to happen, we don't know what. You bring the truck back to the garage, you switch the boxes, and you get this stuff out. People get their stuff on time, and then you find out what's wrong and you fix it. That costs you a lot less money than if it breaks down on the road. You got to send out a tow truck, whatever. That's just one simple example, but there's tons of examples. So part of digital technology, the Japanese companies invest a lot in digital technology. But what digital agility measures is for each dollar that you invest, how much do you increase profits or sales or productivity, output per worker? And that's out of the 64 countries. Japan came in 64th. So it's spending a lot of money, but it's getting less bang for the buck. Now, partly that's because the way companies look at it, they're stuck in old ways of doing things. It's also, Japan has not prized software, it had prized hardware. Japan's got about a half a million fewer software engineers and other kinds of informational technology professionals than it needs. That's going to grow to perhaps 800,000 or a million by the end of the decade. Now, they're trying to import a lot of technologists from overseas, but they're not paying as much as other people are paying, say in Singapore. And so they're not getting them. So again, part of this is you can point to the lack of enough software engineers, or partly it's the mindset of an old company that became big and powerful in the analog era. And they're not used to thinking the way a digital era is. Another way is, they're in an analog era, it was big companies that did most of the R&D. They did everything, totally everything themselves, soup to nuts. They didn't really cooperate that much with other companies. Well, in the digital era, companies are really webs of networks of companies, with maybe giant at the top. But Google did not invent Gmail. A small company invented it for Google. Amazon did not invent Alexa. Pfizer did not invent the Pfizer vaccine. It was a German startup founded by two immigrants from Turkey, married couple. So it's a tremendous globalization story. Well, that's a digital era way of doing things, which is extremely, extremely efficient. But if you're used to doing everything yourself and you have trouble working that way, you're stuck in a 1960s or 70s mindset, then you're not going to get a lot of benefit from what you invest in. And that's the problem. Let me just add one thing. So, one of the results, which is one of the things that makes me optimistic about the political potential of getting more support from entrepreneurship. So Toyota understands that it will not be able to compete for long unless it masters this digital technology. It also knows that people in-house don't know nothing about how to do it. And so what Toyota has done is partnered with independent, newer companies. Now, not all of them, when I say startup, some of them will never be on the stock market. They may be 100 people or 50 people, but they're still very innovative and valuable. So now Toyota has more software companies as first tier suppliers than hardware parts makers. And moreover, these software companies, they don't want to become part of the Toyota Keiretsu. They don't want to be a servant. They want to be equal. They want to collaborate with Toyota, but they also want to collaborate with Honda and Nissan and with people in the non-automotive field. They want their independence. And yet Toyota has no choice but to work with them because it needs them. So that poses a question for Toyota. So do you fear the startups because they may hurt your business and challenge you? Or do you welcome the startups because they can help you do things you need to do? You're conflicted. Not only say Toyota maybe for another big company against it, but different people within Toyota. The R&D people will say, no, we don't need these outsiders. And so you get all these splits. And now you get a thing like Japan, only 8% of all of the government aid to R&D goes to companies under 300 people, which is who really needs it. It goes to these bigger companies that don't need it. So, what's your stance? And it has to do with the tax system, because it's a tax credit, but only companies that are profitable can have a advantage of a tax credit. But if you have what's called a tax carry forward, which is when you become profitable 10 or 15 years later, then you can still use it. Japan doesn't have that. That's a very simple thing to fix. No one would even know you're doing it. It's so obscure. So, where does Toyota stand on that? Do they want the tax break so they can have more innovative startups they can work with? Or they oppose it because maybe these startups will somehow hurt them, become a challenge, and different companies? That creates a split in the business world. That split opens the way for political entrepreneurs to put in all in the bureaucracy, among diet members, among academics who will lobby for these things, and among some of these companies to lobby for small steps that create more entrepreneurs. And then once there are enough entrepreneurial companies and they're getting that way, they now have enough clout. They can go to the bureaucrats directly. They can go to the diet members directly and say, hey, do this, do this. They can start to become a lobby that the politicians and bureaucrats have to pay attention to. So it's just a fascinating transition in society. And technology has this tremendous power to alter the social balance of power. That a lot of people think it's an economic phenomenon, which it is, but it's also technology is really a political phenomenon as well. It's just a fascinating, fascinating topic to me, as you can probably tell.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I wish that we had so much more time to talk about it. But there is just one more thing I wanted to get your opinion on because as of the time of recording, I just graduated from Japanese language program where I got to do a little bit of research on the startup ecosystem in Japan. And
Congratulations.
thank you. So I've attended so many events in Japan, sponsored by the government in particular. And so I've been able to see firsthand how much money, how many initiatives, how many words are being put towards supporting the Japanese startup ecosystem. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts or opinions about the programs that they've been rolling out lately.
Sad to say, they're very disappointing. They're very, very disappointing. It's a lot of, I will boldly do this. Every time a prime minister says, I will boldly do something, you know, nothing's going to happen. So, so let me give you a couple examples. So I mentioned this tax break for R&D. It's a very simple thing. It could have been done. It wasn't done. Um, there are other things that could be done. For example, Kishida rolled out this tax break for people who invest in startups. It's called an angel tax because angels are the ones who provide the seed money for companies to start. But a whole bunch of other things that really need to be done. And I spoke to a senior official at METI, and I asked him, you know, because the tax bureau at the Ministry of Finance always opposes anything that involves tax breaks for people who need it. But they're okay with tax breaks for big corporations, or at least. So Kishida at that time wanted to double the defense budget, and he said as a percentage of GDP, and he said he was going to finance part of it by revoking some of the tax cuts for big corporations. And so Guy Ameti said, our top, when I said, what are you going to do for tax benefits to promote entrepreneurship? He said, our top priority is to prevent Kishida from rolling back some of the tax break for big corporations. That's our top priority. I said, well, can't you do both at the same time? No, that's our top priority. So basically, they didn't push. Now, that R&D tax credit never happened. There's like 6 or 7 things that just never happened. So out of all this Tisha's big talk about all he's going to do for entrepreneurship, or even other things, you know, a lot of SMEs don't use digital technology because they don't know what it would do for them. They don't have the cloud because they don't know what it would do for them. Well, in Europe, government spent a lot of money teaching small companies what it will do for them. And then they adopt it and it improves their productivity. Japan spends a piddling amount. I mean, they could spend more on that. That's something that really upgrade the quality of business, right? So they don't do any of that. So the one thing that came through with this alleged tax cut for angels, but the way that it was designed, uh, it's an individual new company. Now, most new companies fail. I mean, most companies, new companies that are funded by big, sophisticated angel funds fail. But the fewer, that's the minority that succeed so well that your overall returns are terrific. So in France, which was considered just as anti-entrepreneurial as Japan 25 years ago, they developed a program and you invested in an angel fund. And French people just stampeded toward it, got a lot of tax breaks, and entrepreneurship just took off in Japan, and unicorns and smaller startups and people doing deep tech and stuff. Well, in Japan, they didn't say you could invest in a fund. You had to invest in an individual company. Well, no one's going to do it. It's like 10 times riskier than investing in an individual company on the stock market. I mean, no one's going to do it. It's not going to happen. And you sort of wonder, why was it designed in such a way that was going to make it ineffective? So there's a lot of stuff that on paper you think they're doing things, but a lot of it's for show. It doesn't really work. And or some really sincere bureaucrat put something together and it got watered down by the time it came out of the political process. There was an advisory council report that came out of the Cabinet Science and Technology and Innovation Office. That was a superb report. It was worked on by both bureaucrats and outside people. It went through all of the problems, the key problems that were blocking Japan entrepreneurship. Kisha didn't even allow them to say what the solution should be because he knew METI and MOF would disagree, and he didn't want that to happen before that upper house election. He said, we'll do it later. They never got to do it, and ended up none of the stuff that he said he should do did they do. So right now, they're not doing it. And really, what they could do, start off taking very small steps. When it comes to reform, sequencing is key. So you start off with some small steps that have low political cost. Sometimes because no one even knows you're doing it. They never heard of it, like a tax carryover credit. Who the hell knows what that is, right? So no one would protest it because they don't even know what it is, except for the MOF Tax Bureau. And you start off with those. They have low budgetary cost. They have low political cost, but they work. And in China, this is actually how Deng Xiaoping brought about that reform. One little step that builds credibility, allows a further step, more credibility, further steps. And it also creates more entrepreneurs who, as I said before, could begin to lobby for even further steps, and you can snowball the process. And you need a lot of work before it becomes big enough to really turn around the growth picture. But this is something that can be done, and there are people who are working on it. Most of the proposals that I have in the book actually came from Japanese people. I'm really not that smart. I couldn't think of this stuff myself. I talked to people who know something. And so I synthesized their proposals, and a couple I did myself. But basically, it's not like people in Japan don't know what to do. The Sharpies do know what to do. The problem is the political willingness to do it of people, just like companies trying to keep things doing the old ways that work, so is the government. But they don't work anymore. And they really need to change course. And what I would say is the Japanese people are not satisfied, and for good reason. Real wages falling, old age pensions being cut. And the way the LDP stays in power is not because people like the LDP. They don't. It's because the opposition is so hapless. And the people who don't like the LDP just stay home. In 2009, Democratic Party of Japan convinced people it was really different. It was going to change things. So all those people who had been staying home came out in droves. They won in a landslide. Its turnout has dropped every further election. And the LDP has to fear that unless it turns the economy around, one day, the same thing's going to happen again. They're going to lose power, maybe this time for longer. So we'll see. That gives some pressure. And plus, there's some politicians in the LDP who do understand that these changes have to be made if Japan's going to be able to grow again. So there's a real, there is this contest, and that's why I called it the contest, between those who want to, it's not even defending the status quo. It's an attempt to sort of say, let's make Japan great again by doing what used to work. And it's not working. And those who really see the need for change. And there's this contest. And based upon past track record, people would be pretty pessimistic. But given these underground changes, I think Japan has a greater opportunity to make these changes than ever before because of the underlying trends in generational attitudes, technology, globalization, the demographic crunch, the political consequences of low growth. And so no one can foresee what will happen, but it's a real contest. It's no longer a one sided battle anymore. And that's all to the good.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of what you said resonates with the conversations that I've had with entrepreneurs in Japan, with Japanese people in terms of those political structures here and the inertia in making real change in terms of the Japanese government, let alone the economy. And so thank you so much for breaking that down for us. And it looks like we're about coming up on time today. But before we wrap things up, is there anything that you wish that we had had a little bit more time to talk about or that you wish I had asked you today?
Well, yeah, I mean, stories are great. So you learn about these people. So let me just tell you one story. So, typically the people who start companies all around the world are between age 27 and age 43, not younger than 27, because most entrepreneurs start off in larger companies where they have some experience of how a business actually operates and they have some managerial experience of handling people. At 43, you get kind of tired, you're stuck in old ideas, whatever. Okay. So I met this one guy who formed a company called Rocksool. It's like an Uber for parcel delivery, but he did it before Uber was created. He created it when he was 1 year out of Keio University. So, of course, he had no business experience. But he got some financing. It was a great idea. His company is taking off and it's now in the stock market. But he was losing. It's a very IT intensive company. A lot of people who really know, because it's web centric, the way it works. And 30-40% of his people were leaving every year. Now, you can't keep a company running. He had no idea what to do. So he says, I hire some veterans, people older than me and smarter than me. How do you run a business? I said, mean people in the 50s? He goes, oh, no, no. People in their 30s who would know knew human relations. And they came there. And he said, the problem is you're talking to people about how much money they're going to make when the company gets bigger, blah, blah, blah. But they didn't join your company only to make money. Sure, they want to make money, but they also want to do something to make Japan better. You're not talking to them about the mission of the company. And one side effect about making it better, not only is it more efficient and the truck drivers will earn more, but since you can carry more parcels per truck by the way they do it, you need the truck to travel fewer miles for every package, which means less carbon emissions for every package. So it helps the fight against global warming. You got to talk to your people about what you're doing, what the mission is. Within a year, they got the turnover rate down to about 10%. Now, that's because they had the business experience. But if not for this change in the generational thing, he would not have been able to hire those people and his company would have failed. And people would say, see, that shows Japanese are not good entrepreneurs. No, what it shows is he couldn't hire the experts that he needed. And so there are lots of these stories when you talk to people that are very exciting about what they want to do, what they have done, how it gets done. And so, gee, if we had another half hour, I would just regale you with stories of the people I met. And I think economics is ultimately about people. And what gives me confidence is this layer. You don't need a big percentage of the population to be entrepreneurial or willing to work for a startup to turn the economy around, but you need some. And I feel very hopeful because I've seen these changes, particularly in these people in their 20s and their 30s, and even in their 40s. So it's a very exciting thing.
Yeah, exactly. And there's, of course, as long as there are good people on the ground, good, smart people continuing to push for these changes, continuing to make good policy that hopefully somebody will eventually pick up and actually implement. I'm also optimistic that things will be able to change for the better in Japan.
Yes.
But yeah, thank you for being so generous with your time today. If you have not already, be sure to pick up the book. I'll put a link in the description of this episode so you can find it. Also, be sure to check out Richard Katz's Substack for a little bit more up to date information on the goings on in Japan and with the government and the economy.
It's called Japan Economy Watch.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Looking forward to the next book.
Yeah. Oh, no, don't say that. No, I'm too tired. But I'm looking forward to the next conversation.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Very good. Bye-bye. Have a good morning. Bye-bye.
I hope that you enjoyed today's conversation. Be sure to check out the links in the description of this episode to learn more about Richard Katz and his work. Also, be sure to click through to subscribe to his Substack page. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and share it with a friend, colleague, or connection on LinkedIn to help spread the perspectives and information shared in the podcast. And please remember to go ahead and subscribe or follow on whatever platform you're using, and also leave a rating and review if you enjoyed the podcast. If you'd like to support the podcast, there are a few things that you can do. You can support the podcast using the listener support button on Spotify for podcasters, or contribute to my Ko-fi page. You can find the link to do so in the description of this episode. I'd love to hear from you directly, so if you'd like to leave a voice message, you can find a link to do that in the description as well. But for now, remember that the more you learn, the more confident you will become as you explore all of the opportunities Japan has to offer you. Until next time, mata kondo.